You're listening to Schmidt Talks, the podcast wing of schmidttalks.com, with writer and blogger Heather Christena Schmidt. With a new episode each week, Schmidt talks about all the things you never knew you needed to hear about in these truly dystopian times. From politics and current events to life and living, Heather covers it all in this philosophical and introspective show. Come back every Monday for a new episode and get more info on Heather and her work at schmidttalks.com. And now for the show.
Thanks for tuning in to Schmidt Talks, an extension of my long-running blog, schmidttalks.com. My name is Heather Christena Schmidt. I'm a mom, a writer, a blogger, and a critic of pretty much everything. You're listening to Season 1, Episode 2. Little housekeeping to do. This podcast is a new project for me, and I'm still working out the kinks. To that end, you may notice changes in the music, the sound, and if you have suggestions of your own, please head to schmidttalks.com or one of my social media channels and shoot me a message with your ideas. I'm an open book. Our first season has a theme: words matter. I'm a firm believer that part of the problem with our society as a whole is that our words have lost their meaning amidst rhetoric, messaging, politicization, and the now socially acceptable practice of gaslighting. People these days seem to think they can just riff a term and it'll mean whatever they want it to mean. That they can claim, well, I didn't mean that, even if they did. But we live in a reality, at least for now, and if we're going to ever get out of these truly dystopian times, we're going to need to get back to basics. Each week, we'll talk about a word that has been misused, disabused, and lost its thread. And if we do it right, we'll bring some sense of normalcy to it all. Bring the world back to life. Bring the word to its original form. Words matter. They have meaning. Our word this week is democracy. There is an effort afoot, mostly within the Democratic Party, to make this midterm election about saving our democracy. I see it everywhere on Twitter. I've heard people accuse others of being a threat to our democracy. The president has uttered it a time or two. And while the voting rights bill certainly did fall flat on its face in the United States Senate, it has become a common theme in the state primaries. And I suspect it will be a prevalent messaging campaign, again, at least on the Democratic side of things, in the general election. Of course, the Republican Party has embraced the destruction of democracy with ongoing restriction of freedoms and rights and the absolute war on voting rights. They're flagrant about it. They do it openly. And this is happening in particular in the southern states, in states where Republicans have a firm grip over control of their individual legislatures and their seats in the United States Congress. Many happen to be ones in which people of color and the poor, working class, represent a bulk of the voter base. But the Democrats seem to think they have, for one, community of colors in the bag. And regardless of race, they, again, for whatever reason, believe that they represent the working class on the whole. And over the years have come to just assume that it's here that they will secure their elections if they just make it easier, safer, and more accessible for people, especially of those groups, to vote. To that end, on the Democratic Party side of this, there is a push to expand voting rights and make it easier to vote. And the Democrats have somehow correlated this effort to preserving democracy. Now, I want to be clear here. I completely endorse expanding voting rights and for governments to make it easier. Here, where I am in Southern California, we have vote by mail available to everyone, but it doesn't stop there either. Election centers are now open for several days leading up to an election day. You can sign up for tracking of your ballot to ensure it's been counted. There are a host of efforts that are made here to make it as easy as physically possible for people to vote, but to do so securely. And this is what I believe is the definition of voting rights, what it really boils down to. Not arguments over who can and should be voting, rather making it as simple as possible for everyone in the United States to vote. Because the laws that govern the United States affect everyone living here. But back to this notion of democracy, because I don't agree that making it easier is necessarily preservation of our democracy. You can make it easier to vote and everyone will still vote for an authoritarian. We've seen this in history. We've seen this all over the world. Ease of voting is not correlative to democratic principles. Rather, the election of representatives that advocate for the actual interests of all people is. And in the US, that ain't happening. I would argue that neither Democrats nor Republicans, nor a handful of the third parties that are out there, are truly representatives of democracy. True democracy, at least. And yet the Democratic Party is representing itself as the only party that stands for it, which, as we'll see, is an oxymoron in and of itself. And this is the first thing, and probably the most important thing, that I think we need to address, this notion about the Democratic Party. First and foremost, we need to step it back just a second and concede that the GOP does not stand for democracy. That is true. The Democrats are right about that. The GOP elevated Donald Trump, arguably the worst president in American history. And they stood by while he and his MAGA crew carried out an insurrection on the Capitol. Today, a year and a half later, they have backpedaled on holding anyone accountable for that in the upper levels of the government. Moreover, they have accepted that Trump is the hill upon which they wish to die. He's still doing rallies. His endorsement is as valuable as being his enemy is a death sentence to any campaign. And honestly, I believe that he is going to be their candidate in 2024. Either him or Ron DeSantis, his mini-me. But does that mean that the Democratic Party is the only one left to stand for democracy? In Congress and in state legislatures around the country for years, controlled by both Republicans and Democrats, a plethora of legislation has been passed to restrict the rights of third parties and their candidates. And we're talking about decades. This has been going on for decades. The third party candidates have a much more rigorous requirement of signatures in many states to be on the ballot. Their filing is timed differently than the two main parties as well. Third parties have occasionally fought this in court, but as with all things in court, the enforcement of court decisions, it rarely happens. And if we're being honest here, is it even accurate to call it a third party? There are so many third parties. It's ridiculous to even consider it a third. There are just political parties, and there are not only the two, but Democrats and Republicans would have you believe that. They've used political stability as their main excuse for passing this legislation. That some other party will create instability that rocks the nation beyond a point of return. This is a talking point meant to explain away a truly anti-democratic practice that is in the legislature, that has gone on for decades, and that they are both responsible for. You cannot have a democracy with two parties and two parties alone, controlling everything, if they are not all truly representative of the values and beliefs of everyone. The mere existence of third parties and no party preference ballot designations refutes that notion. People always refer to America as having a two-party system, and it is an appropriate way to refer how it plays out in American politics and on the ballot. But the reality is that in this country, we have over 420 political parties spread around throughout the entire country, all placed on various points along the scale of political viewpoints. Their mere existence makes a two-party system undemocratic on its face. The problem is that massive amounts of corruption and concurrent lack of campaign finance restrictions ends up rendering it that two parties in control, the Democrats and the Republicans, because they themselves effectively and efficiently every election stomp out any third, fourth, fifth, 420th parties that threaten their stranglehold on the power in government. To change this system, of course, it'll have to be changed from the outside. You cannot legislate election reform, in particular immense campaign finance laws, when the corruption from within is who you are asking to change the rules. What incentive do they have to do that? None. Absolutely none. Local and state propositions are how this will have to change, until you have enough people that have risen to power that are not of the two parties, that represent a broader spectrum of American viewpoints to change things on the national level. But does America have that much time? I don't know. And the bigger question is, if a significant number of groups, parties, and people are being suppressed from ever gaining a seat at the legislative table, can we really call what we have now an American democracy, or a democracy at all? People's social and political viewpoints do not clearly fit into the framework of those two parties. As I said, in this country, we have 420 different political parties. For my own point, people always peg me as a Democrat, and I ran as a Democrat for a nonpartisan seat in 2020, but I always considered myself to not really fit into either of those molds. And as it turns out, the vast majority of Americans kind of agree. In fact, new parties are cropping up every election to try to address this. Now, I'm not saying they're effective. This year, Andrew Yang has formed his own political party, the Forward Party. Honestly, his party is a joke. And a lot of them are a joke. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is that as soon as these new political parties like Yang's get any kind of recognition or press or money, both parties pounce. They pounce to stomp out that competition, to stomp out those voices. And that's what they're doing now with Yang, and that's what they've done for decades with all the others. Immediately after Yang announced the formation of his new party, Democrats in particular went for the jugular, publishing the funding Yang's party had received to tie him to right-wing anti-democratic organizations. On social media, the paid political bots have hit a fever pitch. In fact, just this week, Newsweek reported on the appearance of typos in the Democratic Party's arsenal of Twitter bot accounts that have responded on this issue. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic and embarrassing. And again, against this idea that the Democratic Party is the party of democracy. This is not democracy. This is suppression and silence. Again, they are doing that which they accuse everyone else of doing. And they can't even do it well. But I want to get back to this notion that the way to save democracy is simply by voting for Democrats. Because when we think about all of this flagrant suppression of third parties that goes on, the Democratic Party as a body of policy is in practice antithetical to democracy, same as the GOP. And I also think we need to look at the way that the Democratic base operates, because it's not just the party in the legislature that's the problem, it's all of their supporters too. They mercilessly go after the left whenever anything goes wrong. Whereas a Republican fucks up and they basically admit it. And they'll just say, what are you going to do about it? When a Democrat fucks up, the base goes on a scapegoating mission, looking for anyone to point the finger at that is not them. Correlate everyone with Republicans if they can. Accuse people of helping Republicans by not unilaterally falling in line with every Democratic candidate or position. Put simply, they eat their own young. Say anything wrong about a Democrat or refuse to support one whose ideas you do not resonate with. It is the Salem witch trial, public flagellation and all. The notion of accountability is just dead in politics with Democrats and Republicans. Today, if you try to hold Biden accountable for even the most flagrant of offenses, there is an entire cadre of women with profile pictures of Kamala Harris's sneakers ready to pounce, to give you the what for about how dangerous publicly acknowledging mistakes is, and how at least he's not golfing like Trump golfing is any better than Biden taking 3-day weekends to Delaware and week-long vacations at the beach. Or forget about Biden, let's talk about Nancy Pelosi. While COVID is raging and still largely defunded, the world is becoming increasingly unstable. Monkeypox is threatening to further destabilize the globe. We're arguably heading straight down into a recession. Inflation is making it increasingly more difficult for average Americans to put food on the table and gas in their cars. The working class is having to take second and third jobs just to pay the rent. Housing is at a crisis point across the nation. Climate change is becoming an undeniable problem. We have a profound shortage of housing that has made homelessness skyrocket and people to resort to live in their cars, not for lack of funds all the time, but lack of options. While all of this is going on, Nancy Pelosi is getting away with insider trading. And she's taken a $90 million trip to Taiwan against the advice of national security advisors and is a flagrant fuck you to the Chinese government. $90 million. Absolutely no one is questioning this or holding her accountable. Rather, she and her daughter remain the highest in demand guest speakers at Democratic Party brunches and tea parties across the entire country. The party of democracy? Think about all of this for a minute. The whole notion of American democracy is built upon rejecting a government that refused any level of responsibility or accountability. The saying, taxation without representation is tyranny, was a founding principle. It was the reason for the Boston Tea Party and the spark that ignited the American Revolution. This is a statement of accountability that a government cannot take and take and take and take and give nothing in return. And yet here we are today, unable to even acknowledge when our leaders fall flat on the give part. And to circle back to voting, there is this idea today in American politics that party is above policy, an idea that is especially pervasive in the Democratic Party, at least in the public. Vote blue no matter who, a phrase that honestly makes me nauseous because it sounds so Republican. And it again goes against the very notion that our democracy was built upon. Freedom. Freedom from tyranny. Freedom to believe how you want, to think how you want. Freedom to vote how you want. People to think these things through, to do your own research. Now the legislatures enact legislation that restricts voting, restricts what information you're allowed to have. Well, the Republicans do, but then the Democratic legislatures go along with it. They restrict voting by limiting the options. They restrict what information you have access to. They work with major corporations to limit what information you can get. How that is any different than what the Republicans do, I fail to see. And I think that a phrase like vote blue no matter who represents that lack of freedom, that lack of an individual's perceived ability to make conscious and good decisions. That a person is supposed to just vote for who you tell them to vote for. Don't think about it. Just do what you're told. Think about that for a minute. There seems to be nothing more anti-democratic than the Democratic Party doing this. While the Republicans have bowed to the altar of fascism and authoritarianism, supporting insurrectionists and corruption at every level, they're at least honest about it. They at least do it in the public. They're clear. They don't give a fuck. The Democrats, they've tried to control the message by ignoring the problems, controlling the people, and inaccurately representing who they are. So we see how the people in power have bastardized this notion of democracy in such extreme ways. It's democracy, except not really, because everyone hasn't had input. And even if they have, their input has been skewered and ignored, invalidated. Perhaps the most dangerous threat to our democracy that I see is in local politics. Politicians often get onto local school boards, city councils, counter supervisorial boards, and they run amok. They ignore people that they represent that are members of their own communities. They ignore their neighbors, which is just, it's crazy to me. Local seats that are elected positions are perhaps some of the most consequential positions because the people are making decisions that directly affect your life. Things like what textbook is used in the school that your child goes to, or how much housing is being built in your community. Those are the things that affect your life, your daily life, and your long-term outcomes. And these people are ignoring your input on them. These are the venues where every single adult should have input. And they do not. And these local politicians use our national legislature as a guidebook or as an approval of doing this. Local elected officials generally perceive their election as a mandate to do whatever they want, even if it is inconsistent with the reasons upon which they were elected. Just last week in my own county, the county supervisors went into closed session to select a new county CEO, someone that manages the county, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars from the taxpayer coffer, and they did not even accept public comment. Think about that for a minute. Taxation without representation is tyranny. Save our democracy? Our democracy is on the ballot. Is it though? I think in reality, what is truly on the ballot is fascism. The Republicans are fascists and the Democrats are fascists on a fascist diet. Until we evaluate this word, this term, democracy, and understand it for what it truly is, democracy, we will never have democracy in the literal sense. Perhaps the easiest way to approach this is to end with a definition and a question. Democracy is a government where every person is heard. I'll say that again. Democracy is a government where every person is heard. Do you feel heard?
You've been listening to Schmidt Talks, the podcast wing of schmidttalks.com, with writer and blogger Heather Christena Schmidt. With a new episode each week, Schmidt Talks talks about all the things you never knew you needed to hear about in these truly dystopian times. Thank you for listening. And make sure to come back every Monday for a new episode. You can get more info on Heather, her social media channels, and all of her work at schmidttalks.com. Stay safe.